Hey, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. We have officially changed the name from 1776 Podcast to Format Podcast. It has come to our attention. There is a group of white supremacists that are also going by the name 1776. And so I figured we should probably change it. But Format Podcast comes from Forrest and Matthew, the two hosts of this show. And we're also business partners with a construction company that we also recently changed the name of to Format Construction. So we've got Format Construction for our real job and building homes. And now we've got Format Podcast, kind of just keep everything unified. But on today's episode, we have on Dylan Bures, who is a local filmmaker here in Austin, a history buff, and did a short film that's on YouTube about permaculture in the Texas Hill Country and restoring the land that was just fascinating and been shared around a bunch of times and starting to get a lot of attention, rightfully so. It was a really great film. He's done a couple other and has a lot more on the way that we dove into, and he knows Texas history extremely well. And so we went down a few different rabbit holes on this episode, and I'm just really had a great time talking with him about everything he's up to and a lot of history. So hope y'all enjoy, and a quick shout out to our sponsor, Rambler Sparkling Water. As always, we are very thankful to have them on board. Just a great local water company. And yeah, hope you guys enjoy. We switched it, and I don't know, podcast names are funny. It's like, how do you come up with the right name for something? And we're like, okay, we already have Format for construction. Like, we don't really have a point to this podcast or any sort of like,
might as well just embrace or keep the same branding across and utilize the SEO. Yeah, it's like the same thing when I started the YouTube channel. It's like, I could come up with a name, or I could just use my name.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use my name.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
So I first saw your video about the Texas Hill Country and all the permaculture and that group that you worked with. And so, I mean, what inspired you to make that video? If no one's seen it before, I highly recommend checking that out. I think your YouTube channel is your name.
Yep. It's just my first name, last name.
Okay. Can you say it and spell it real quick?
Yeah, it's my name is Dylan Bures. Okay. That is the correct way to say my last name. It's been anglicized here in Texas for many years, but it's Dylan Bures. And yeah, I'm on YouTube. Pretty new channel. I think we're only about 7 months in, but it's grown crazy fast, which is amazing. And we just released a video on the Texas Hill Country called the Rise, Fall, and Repair of the Texas Hill Country. It's about basically a little bit about the history of the Texas Hill Country and the kind of processes that have led to its current state, both from a natural perspective, and then kind of what some people, specifically one group called Symbiosis Texas, are doing to combat that. But they are just one of many pieces of the battle to kind of regenerate the Hill Country. So when it comes to what kind of inspired me to start that, though, I grew up here in Austin. I'm born and raised here in Austin, and so I've spent all my summers and springs, going to Barton Springs, going out into the Hill Country. I still remember the first time as a kid I went to Pedernales State Park, and I saw the falls there, and it was just like just the craziness of seeing everybody who's been there knows the falls with the rocks. It's just like an alien landscape, right? Enchanted Rock, you name it. So I spent a lot of time growing up out there. So for me, that was a really important piece. And then I started this channel it technically started in January. I had been thinking about it for a long time. And I had started reading the works of a guy named Alexander von Humboldt. Alexander von Humboldt was basically a Prussian. I don't think he really had a title at that point. He basically became to start what's now known as ecology. And so I had started reading some of his work and kind of his autobiography. And, he talks a lot about how he had gone into very early pre-colonial Spain or colonial Spain, we're talking 16s or early 1700s. Okay. And basically he had gone there and he had kind of witnessed what the Hill Country has gone through now, but where basically they're clear cutting for plantations and haciendas and all that stuff. They're starting to clear cut and, build out fields and all these types of stuff. And he's doing that in the 1700s, and he's noticing the kind of impact of what that has on the ecosystem, and he's basically calling out, hey, we should probably not cut down all of our trees, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, it's a little different down there. But that kind of was like, okay, cool, I'm doing this YouTube channel on Texas and Texas history and Texas nature. The hill country's near and dear to me. I grew up here. And I'm reading this work about this guy who's noticing all this stuff. I started being like, okay, cool. Like, I had been reading stuff about the hill country where it used to be covered in cedar forests and stuff like that. I should look more into that. Maybe that's interesting. And then just by chance, I came across Symbiosis through a friend of a friend via social media. Not even directly. They'd posted something, I guess, about them or like shared a story or something.
And that's the company that's going around and doing this work.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And they're one of many. But Symbiosis is who I work with a lot. Adam and Michael and the team there are super awesome dudes. We're actually working on more stuff right now.
Very cool.
And they're just like such salt of the earth, like true Texan, just out there every day, just no problem with a pickaxe or a shovel when it's 105 outside. But yeah, I kind of came across them and I was like, well, you guys are super rad. Like, let's chat. And so I didn't even have a video concept in mind when I spoke with them first. It was kind of just like, there's something here. I don't know what it is, but we'll find something to make. And so I got on a call with them and we kind of started talking, and then they had let me know about, what they do and how they work and kind of what they're a part of. And so we met and basically settled on the property that we ended up showing, which basically talks about like a little bit of how, a little bit of, I shouldn't say a little bit of, it's a lot of work. But basically a little bit of intuition and a little bit of research can go a long way in basically regenerating a piece of land in the hill country, and how simple and not necessarily complicated things can make a huge impact out there. And yeah, that's kind of where that video came from. I don't want to go too much into the the like hyper details, but yeah, they're super rad. We actually had to cut out, I think in that film's 35 minutes long. I cut out another 20 minutes of just information from that video because it's so there's so much information and there's so much knowledge. But I highly recommend checking out the film, like I said. And then if you're ever interested in more, I can't promise anything, but I think Symbiosis and I are working on some more in-depth stuff with their channel to be announced maybe. But we're hoping to kind of basically talk more about the specifics that they're doing. So if you own land in Texas or you're really interested in permaculture, hopefully we can kind of tell some more stories about that and kind of the actual specifics. And then also from there, I have another video that we're working on right now that kind of piggybacks off that about cedar trees. So it's a whole Pandora's box of stuff. So,
Oh, yeah. It's endless. And I think for a lot of people, they just don't realize. I mean, I think you drive through the hill country and you think that's what it's always looked like.
Yeah,
and I
correct.
think most people assume that, or they move here and they're like, wow, this is beautiful, but they don't realize how barren it really looks. And
Correct,
there's
yeah.
no native grasses. You're just looking at, limestone bluffs that one time probably had, topsoil on them and grasses on them, and, massive old growth cedar trees that aren't really around anymore.
Correct.
And I recently read Cedar Choppers, and it was interesting about how many trees they really cut down for that industry. And it's really shaped Texas. And so it's really cool to see you highlighting that, and it also getting a lot of attention. I mean, I've heard about the short film you did from several people now. And it seems like it's been getting a lot of views. I think last time I checked, you were coming on like 30,000 views or something. And it's only, a few weeks old?
Yeah. I'm pushing 30 this morning. I was arguing with people in the comments on my drive here. So,
there you go.
As one does. But yeah, no, it's been super awesome. And it's interesting because when I started the channel, the intention, I had wanted to do films like this when I started the channel, but it's always like, I'm just some guy. Do people actually care about this stuff? I don't know.
It's a lot of work to just roll the dice on it.
Yeah, and so what I did is I'd started with more traditional YouTube style stuff where it's like my first video was on Menard and the Presidio San Saba and like Spanish silver mines. Very like, I don't want to say clickbaity because it's not like everything's true, but it's a little more like SEO focused and like very simple history narrative.
Did you say Spanish silver mines?
Yes.
What is that?
So in basically the story of Menard and whatnot is essentially in Menard, Texas, you have two kind of there's like two abandoned forts. So you have
Is that southwest or south Texas?
It's west of Llano and Mason. So if you get on Highway 29 you just keep going, way out there on the plateau. So basically in Menard, there's two abandoned kind of forts. So you have Fort McCavitt, which was a U.S. Army fort that was abandoned. It's now a National Historic Site that you can visit. They've kind of restored a lot of the buildings. It's pretty cool. And then there's the Presidio de San Saba, which was one of the first Mexican presidios in Texas. And it's way out there. Like if you think about Menard now, it's out there. Like it's way out there. And especially back when the Spanish built that, it was isolated as heck.
Do we know what year? Was that like 1500?
Oh, maybe, man. Quizzing me here.
Not exactly. I'm just curious.
I think it was like late 1500s, early 1600s, I think would have been. 1600s to mid 1600s, I think would have been the timing. So basically, the gist of it is that the Spanish established the Presidio de San Saba, mostly like most Spanish missions to convert natives, whatever. But while they were there, they found a fort garrison sent an attachment actually to the Riley Mountains in Llano County. And while they were there, they discovered, based on reports of like, natives had told them that, there's this crazy silver, the hills are filled with silver, the classic story, whatever. So they go to the Riley Mountains, they start mining a little bit, and basically what happens is they get a little bit of silver, but not enough for the Spanish to be like, this is perfect. They're kind of like, it's not worth it. But in the process of what they had done, they left all that silver slag like on the banks of the San Saba next to the Presidio. And so after they abandoned the Presidio, because again, it's super isolated, there's not really much reason to be out there at this point in time, and they just keep getting attacked over and over again. They're just like, screw this, we're going home, basically.
Attacked by Indians?
Yeah, you're thick in Comanche territory.
Yeah, you're way out there in the plains. There's no cover. There's no protection. Like, you're just like, there's no value for us being here. They just gave up. There's also a lot of political infighting, like with the Spanish. Like in all my research for videos and stuff, you realize a lot of it's also just political because, it's all like governor appointees fighting with officers, you name it. But they give up, they leave, but they leave the silver slag there because they're not going to take it home with them.
And that's just like the residual stuff that you get from mining silver.
Yeah, literally just like, they're like, this is like the rock that we pulled out. They may have fired some of it, and then but they left it there. And so basically when European settlers really start to show up, what happens is they're like, they're in the general area. They hear, they see an abandoned Spanish fort with silver slag, and then they're hearing these tales of lost Spanish silver mines in the hills. So now people, especially think about like the 1840s to 1850s when Texas is being settled in mass, what's going on, California gold rush, right? So people are just like, where's the next one? Where's the next one? Oh my goodness, there's silver in these hills, whatever, right? So people are moving there, trying to, set stuff up, whatever. And then that eventually leads to Fort McCavitt being set up indirectly, just by the fact that there's population. That's the original Texas frontier, right? Before Texas had fully kind of pushed the Comanche out, when Texas was annexed, they set up Fort McCavitt, the U.S. Army. And then eventually that got abandoned too in the 1880s because the frontier had moved how many hundreds of miles west. And so basically that was kind of the gist of that first one, was basically like, why is this, again, no hate on Menard, but if you've been there, it's not exactly the most like, it's a very quiet, very small, middle of nowhere place. And I was like, why are there two abandoned forts here, like separated by like 200 plus years? And it's literally just because, the Spanish decided to leave a bunch of silver rock on the banks of the river. So, when we had started the channel, that was kind of the stuff I was going to do first. And I was like, we'll eventually figure out where we go from there. And then on a whim, I did the San Gabriel video, which is where I followed the San Gabriel River from source to terminus. So it starts in Burnett County and ends in Milam County. I think it might just break over Milam County, but it hits the Little River right before it hits the Brazos. And when we did that video, we shot it like that video went through like 3 different iterations. My buddy Tim, who helps me shoot the videos, he and I had done like 2 separate shoots. It started as a video about Lake Georgetown, and then it morphed into something else, and then it eventually became like about the San Gabriel River. And I posted that one, and I was like, I don't know how this is going to go. It may be terrible. I loved the film and how it came out, but I was like, I don't know if people care. Like, the San Gabriel River is not exactly the most well-known river in the state of Texas. In fact, most people probably don't know about it unless you live on it. Yeah, we posted it, and then it did like 200 views, and then 2 months later, for some reason, the algorithm was just like, you're the chosen one. And then over the course of like 2-3 weeks, it just went from like 200 views to like 15,000, which for us, having only 2 videos on the channel at that time,
That's
is
huge.
insane numbers for us.
Congrats. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks, man. And then from there, I'd already kind of shot a third video, which is probably the most contentious one. But I basically talked about the borders of the Republic of Texas. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that one, but basically what we've been told is the original map of Texas with the borders all the way to Wyoming is incredibly misleading. That went as well as you'd expect it to on YouTube when I tell people that Texas was not as big as you thought it was.
How dare you?
Yeah.
Let's get engagement. Bring it on.
Yeah. So that one did okay, but then it was really the Hill Country video that kind of like turned the screw, so to speak, in a good way. When that Hill Country video came out, I was at like 300 subs. And then the Hill Country video just like from day one just took off. And I think I'm at like 1,300 subs now, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but it's crazy just the growth off.
Well, that early on, yeah, it's incredible,
huge.
and it's a great starting point for you. A good foundation, yeah.
So yeah, it's really awesome. Now it means I like the history stuff. The history stuff's cool. I'm still gonna do it, but it also means I can make stuff that I really want to make, which is kind of tell stories about Texans and Texas history and Texas places, and kind of add my own unique kind of spin on it, which is cool. People care kind of more about my opinion. I'm just a guy on the internet, but that's cool, and so I'll keep doing it. So yeah, that's kind of where we're kind of transitioning now, is a little less just like, here's a place, here's the history, cut and dry, and a little more, how can I pull an abstract? Like, when I make a video, it's always now this idea of, I want somebody to watch it and have something actionable out of it. I don't want it to be like cut and dry transactional information. I want it to be, even if it's something super high level actionable, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm going to go outside and do X, Y, Z. It can literally just be like, I'm more aware and in knowledge about insert X issue or whatever it is. And so that's kind of just drive us forward from here. So
well, that's really exciting, and cool that now you get to really chase your passion a little bit more. And the video about the permaculture in Texas, I've sent around to probably a dozen people, and just the way you put it together was really well. I'm very curious, what's your background? I mean, how did you end up as this dude on the internet, as you would say, making these Texas videos? Let's go through that.
Yeah, so I started in the audio video industry. I went to school for audio engineering.
Where'd you go to school?
So there's actually a conservatory here in Austin called the Recording Conservatory of Austin. So I did my, I would compare it to like a technical school. And so I did my program there, in process recorded 20, 30 plus artists. I'd done albums, slept under consoles, like you name it in the music industry stuff, I'd done it. I helped build studios, and then after about a year in the audio and music industry, I was like, this sucks. Not the actual work, but I was around guys who'd been in the industry for like 20, 30 years and were working 12 to 15 hours a day every day and not making a lot of money. And I was just like, I don't know if this is the most realistic long-term perspectives here. And also, it's brutal work. Like, it's fun work, but it's brutal. So I transitioned out of audio from there. And just by being in the audio world at that time, I had just naturally been around photo and video. So I kind of picked up photo and video. And I started freelancing photo video. And then from there, I kind of did that for a couple of years. And then I got the opportunity to work at the company I work for currently full time. I won't name drop them here, but if you look me up, it's not hidden. You'll find it. So, So I've been working there. I kind of got in at the base level, so to speak, when they were just kind of starting out here in the U.S. And then over the past 6 years, they kind of blew up and grew. And so from there, I kind of got the whole kind of more marketing side of my skill set from there. So I'm a photo video producer there. So it's, producing commercials and advertising, and I also self shoot stuff, but working with big teams, small teams, everything in between, from $500 productions to $200,000 productions and everything in between, and kind of learning everything in between there. And then also, like I said, learning all the marketing pieces, like how to not just post a video, but how to build a platform and build a community and all the various, internet skills, I'd call them nowadays, that go into that. And then that's kind of where I am now. And then I basically, and obviously I freelance during all that too. So I've shot, photography for like Marie Claire magazine and other stuff occasionally when it comes up. And so then, kind of towards the end of last year, I was like, not feeling necessarily fulfilled. I was like, I've been here for 6 years, looking to start kind of doing some stuff that really gets me excited and interested again, and has purpose. And so I kind of toyed around with the YouTube thing for a while, and the idea of it for at least a year. No joke, like literally for a year, I was like, should I do this? Should I not? What should I make it on? What should I not do? I don't know. Non-committal. And then basically I had one really slow period, and I called my buddy Tim up. I was like, hey, I'm going to make a video. You want to help me? And he was like, sure, let's do it. And so we went out and shot the Menard video. And it was like 32 degrees in January and raining the whole time. But I was like, let's just do it. And if I hate it, I hate it. We'll never do it again. And then I did it. And I was like, okay, this was super fun. Let's do it. And so from there, I've just stuck with it, trying to do one video a month, and
one a month at that level of production is a lot.
One a month. Yeah. I've tried. It doesn't always happen, but one a month, and we're here almost one a month. I think I'm behind by one or two, but that's okay. So,
do you have big aspirations of wanting to do this full time, or do you have kind of an end game in mind?
I'm always cautious to be like, oh yeah, this is going to be my full time job. This is what I want to do, because what I don't necessarily want to do is just focus purely on the monetization of it. I think I don't want to, this early at least. I don't want to sacrifice what I'm trying to, like the fulfilling, rewarding piece of it comes from the fact that I'm making stuff that I want to make and tell stories that I want to tell. And what I am cognizant of the money piece, and I'd love to do it full time for sure. And I'm working towards that, but I'm also not, I'm just trying not to get in the mindset per se of like, let's grab 500 sponsors and monetize XYZ from the get-go. I want it to be pretty organic and grow and, let it happen as it should. Because I think we've all seen before, whether it's YouTube or other platforms where, it's fantastic for the first X amount of time, and then suddenly it's like a switch hits and it just isn't the same. So, short answer, yes, I'd love to go full time, but yeah, I'm trying to be very grounded and just focus on the content, and, maybe I'm a little too naive on it, but yeah, just let trust the work and let the work kind of carry me there, and what happens. And then the other cool thing too is like, even if this doesn't end up being a full-time thing by itself, I've met so many awesome people doing really cool stuff that, if I ever decide to transition away from what I'm doing currently, there's so many cool people that I could go potentially do work with, doing cool stuff that isn't even necessarily photo video, right? Like permaculture, stuff like that, where it's like, oh, these are things I'd never even thought about. So, that's the coolest part, is definitely like, it's not necessarily the money for me. It's just meeting all the cool people doing cool stuff that I never would have otherwise met. And then they're introducing me to even more cool people doing cool stuff that I also would have never thought of. And it just grows and grows from there. And so, I'm just trying to let the cards fall as they fall, and just ride the wave, so to speak. So
that's basically exactly what we've done with this podcast.
Nice.
We have no our goal isn't to monetize it, make money. I mean, for us, it's just fun to talk to people. You get connected to people, and you just never know where it's going to lead. And have on one guest like Jace, who then referred you, and it just starts to really snowball. That's exciting. So have you always been interested in Texas Hill Country and these different topics? I mean, has that always been something for you? And
for sure. I like growing up as a kid. I don't want to say I never watched cartoons, but like I grew up like watching like the History Channel at like age 4. Like, I'm sure I'll eventually touch on this at some point in videos, but like I'm a huge World War II history buff, like just insane amounts of like World War II history consumption. But like growing up, like it's all I consumed is just like history. I just grew up. I grew up here in Austin, but a lot of my family, I'm Texas Czech, both sides. So huge Catholic Texas Czech families, both sides, spread across the state, but mostly Southeast Texas. So I've got family in Houston and Dallas, but a lot of my family is down in Victoria, Texas, Jackson County.
I was just in Victoria.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where like my grandparents live. That's where a majority of my family lives, Victoria. But then I've also got family in Jackson County, just up the road, and then Calhoun County on there on the coast too. So I basically spent a lot of my summers and a lot of my time growing up in Victoria County and all those areas. And as you guys know, if you've been there, like there's so much Texas history just ingrained in those areas because that's kind of the heartland of original Texas. And Goliad's there. I've probably driven through Gonzales more times than I could ever count in my life.
Where'd you go to school here in Austin?
I went to Rouse High School up in Leander, Liberty Hill area.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Okay.
I grew up in the suburbs. I was a suburbs kid, but so I grew up or spent a lot of time though down there, and it's just like there's just so much history down there, and you're just surrounded by it. So like it was always like an easy. I think part of it was just like it was an easy, almost like daycare thing to be like, oh, let's take the kids to Goliad today, or let's take the kids to whatever today. And so yeah, I was just around it all the time, and combined my like history passion with being around it all the time. I just became super interested in the Texas history piece of it. And then obviously when I'm back home, I'm, we're in Austin, right? So we've got the Capitals here. We've got the Bob Bullock Museum. We're in the Gateway of the Hill Country. So just by naturally at school, we're going on field trips to the Bob Bullock Museum. We're going on field trips to the Capitol, whatever, and even the Alamo. And so that just kind of all combined, and it became just like a lifelong passion. And then I think the other thing that kind of goes into that too is that it's really hard to find like really good Texas history like content actually, like really polished high level production stuff. Don't get me wrong, there's amazing people doing like a podcast and like informational stuff, but I was also like, as a younger teenager to older teenager, like in the YouTube era, it was like I want to learn about, I don't know, insert X Texas thing, and you look it up and it's like one video that's like 240p from like the Bob Bullock Museum or something. And I was like, I need more. And that was kind of the genesis of the channel in a way too, was like, all right, this doesn't exist, so I'll just make it, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's kind of how it all kind of connected. And like I said, I grew up in kind of the heyday of YouTube as well. So like as a teenager is when YouTube really took off. I graduated high school in 2013. So, basically 2009, YouTube really started to hit its heyday all the way through even today. So I kind of grew up watching like the YouTube arc change and, the focus on short form narratives and short form storytelling and all that stuff. And that's kind of where a lot of the genesis of this came from too, is just being in and around that. And that's also why I'm not gonna say I never want to do a movie, but I'm like I much prefer the like 30 to 40 minutes down to 10-minute category versus like here's an hour and a half too. Yeah. Right. So it's always like, how can I take a story, narrative, whatever, and kind of condense it as much as possible while still touching everything. So yeah, that's kind of the genesis of my origin, so to speak. And then I think one more piece too, kind of go backwards a little bit too, is like I said, I'm Czech American, Czech Texan, whatever you want to call it, Czechian, whatever the term is.
Czechian. I don't think I've heard that one before.
Yeah, on both sides. So like growing up at like Thanksgiving and Christmas, like we would, listen to like polka music was like normal, right? So like I never understood as a kid why people thought polka music was weird, because I was like, what do you mean? Like, it's what we listen to at Christmas. So like that's a huge piece of it too, because obviously whenever you're really ingrained in like the cultural like origin of your family or whatever, you're just really connected to the genealogy and the history of how your family got here. Like I can tell you exactly which ports my family came in from and how they moved. And my dad's like super into genealogy. My aunt is the librarian or curator. I don't remember the exact title. Something with the Texas Czech Heritage Society in LaGrange, Texas. So yeah, just around it all my childhood, and I'm not surprised that it manifested into something at some point. So
yeah, very cool. I want to circle back to World War II.
Yeah,
I thought that was interesting. Why?
It's
all wars. It was obviously a very fascinating war, but What called you into that?
I think as a kid, it was just the cool factor, which sounds terrible to say. World War II probably shouldn't be described as cool. A lot of people died. But I think as a kid, it was the planes and the ships and the battles or whatever. They're cool, right? And as a kid, it's that surface level. As I got older, I think it just became more and more apparent like how much of modern geopolitics and modern issues stem directly from what happened in World War II. You look at kind of the output of what happened there, and it's, a lot of the East versus West narratives kind of were cemented there. A lot of the lines in the Middle East were drawn during World War II, so that creates a whole sort of issues that we're still dealing with today. And you also begin to understand kind of a lot of political differences too when you have like things like fascism and then all these other things, like they all just play together. And it's when you look back at World War II, you can really start to understand a lot of the kind of way cards are falling today and understand that it's not necessarily a surprise. It's not a surprise that a lot of things are the way they are today. You can kind of almost follow the dotted line back to World War II and even World War I to some extent because they're very interlinked. It does. It's just really fascinating to me to kind of see the dominoes fall the way they have and kind of understand like, okay, it's not just there's long term. Something that happens in 1942 can have ramifications for years, decades, centuries. And in a way, too, that kind of connects back to what I'm doing now with Texas history, too, is like you start to understand, like I'm sure you have cedar choppers, like people start cutting down cedar trees in the old growth, and now you look at the hill country. It's the butterfly effect, basically, of small things can just change stuff. So I think that, as I grew older, that kind of cemented it was basically like understanding, like, okay, this war effectively set the modern landscape of what we're dealing with today. Obviously, stuff has happened since then, but that ultimately laid that foundation, so...
Interesting.
Yeah. So
have you gotten into other wars? I mean, do you just kind of study all
in
American history?
general, it's not just American history, it's world history in general. Like I'm just huge into history. So like I'm really, it's weird. I'm really like fascinated by war in general, just like the concept of it and how it like manifests. I would never want to be in one. I hope I'm never in one. I hope none of us ever have to experience one. And I have immense respect for anybody who has been in one because, like, I cannot even comprehend what it's like to have somebody shooting a weapon at you, yet alone explosives. But, like, just the more conceptual side of it is really fascinating to me of, like, not just, like, why does a war happen and what led to that war happening, but even also, like, how do different militaries, approach war? Because every military has different approaches and everybody has different doctrine, whatever. So it gets into a lot of that. And then also it's just history as in general. Like I just like consuming as much history as I possibly can. I mean, again, going back to the Texas stuff, that's part of it is like just wanted to read more and more. And then I just ran out of stuff to read, so to speak. Or I shouldn't say that. There's plenty to read. But I ran out of like surface level, easy to find stuff. And I kept having to dig more and more. So, it goes from everything from like, okay, ancient Greece, stuff like that, all the way through like, colonial times, really, really anything history, I'm going to be at least surface level interested, if not more. So,
what are your thoughts on the moon landing?
Definitely real. Because if it wasn't real, somebody would have spilled the beans at some point. So,
well, if it was real, we would have gone back by now.
People are trying to go back now.
Lost technology.
Do you have any favorite books or resources in World War II? Like if someone wanted to learn more, I mean, I feel like from a high level, I know what went on, but if I don't have much context beyond that, if I wanted to learn more, do you have some favorite books?
I don't necessarily have a favorite book because there's so many. I couldn't give you one off the top of my head. I will say, like, for me, the biggest thing that kind of helped me better understand World War II is the museums. If you ever get a chance to visit, obviously we're super lucky here in Austin. The National Pacific War Museum is in Fredericksburg. Chester Nimitz, the admiral for the Pacific Front, was born and raised in that area.
That's the Nimitz Museum, or is it called? Okay.
Yeah, it's I believe that the actual title is the National Pacific War and History Museum or something like that.
I remember going there as a kid on a field trip.
We always call it the Nimitz Museum, right? But if you really just go there and like take the time to just read through it, like you really understand like the scope of the Pacific War and how crazy it was. The other one is the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's just crazy museum. And like to me, I think that was like the real big thing. That again, going back to as a kid, growing up in the hill country, like we're gonna what we need something to do this weekend during the summer. Let's go to the Chester Museum, the Nimitz Museum, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I'm just surrounded by World War II. But yeah, the museums really, I think, cemented it for me. And then, I've been lucky enough to go to the UK. And so been able to go to some of the Imperial War Museums there too and see kind of the British side of it. And it's like that to me is really what's like cemented and kind of informed me even more is when you see it all in person and you see it all laid out. Because it's not just here's the book with all the information. It's also here's the information next to actual equipment, actual paraphernalia, whatever that were from the war, and it just becomes way more lifelike from there. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I guess kind of same question for Texas history. I mean, is there any resources there that you would tell people to go look for?
Yeah, I'd have to look up the name. There's a fantastic book, and I can pull it up right now.
What kind of phone is that?
That is a Google Pixel. I could not tell you the number. It's got cracks all over it. It's taken many a fall on sets, but it's still hanging in there, man. Still hanging in there. And that's all that matters. What is it? What is the name of the book? It's very long. Let me pull it up. So there's two books that I've really enjoyed about Texas. One was Lone Star by T.R. Fehrenbach. Incredibly long book. I did the audiobook, and I think the audiobook is like 40 hours long.
Holy cow.
That's why I did the audiobook. But it is incredibly dense, like in the best way possible. It's that first one right there, T.R. Fehrenbach. Yeah. So this one, like I said, I couldn't tell you the page count because I did the audiobook, but it was, I think, 40 hours long.
Wow. Does it just go like top to bottom, everything?
Yeah, it is like, encyclopedia of Texas. Like if you want to learn as much as you can in like one place, that's the place to start. I will say it was written, I think, in like the 50s. So there is a little bit of bias. I think political climates are a little different from now versus then. Maybe it's a little more rosy in depiction of certain things than it probably should be in terms of especially the Native Americans. But in general,
like saying like they weren't as brutal as they were?
More in the sense of like, it wasn't as sunshine and roses between the Texans and the Native Americans.
Yeah, not at
all. And, we maybe weren't as nice to them as it's maybe portrayed. But in general, there's just so much information there. It's insane. And the other one I had in here too was a really good one, and that was God Save Texas by Lawrence Wright. Nowhere near as long, and it's a little historical, but it's also kind of Lawrence Wright's like attempt to kind of define what it means to be Texan, which I thought was really fascinating. And he kind of just goes from place to place and kind of talks about how we have this like idea that Texas is X or Texas is Y, but in reality, it's kind of everything. And like your definition of Texan, there's not real one definition of Texan. Like there is a definition, but it's undefinable in a way. Like even the most liberal Texan versus the most conservative Texan may hate each other's guts politically, but they'll still identify with each other as Texan in a way. Like there's like a lot of that kind of conversation. So super awesome book. Those would be the first two. When it comes to just general Texas identity and history, when it comes to the more natural side, I've got it right here next to me. I promise this isn't a plug, but this is actually the video that I'm working on next. Like I said, it's Wanted Mountain Cedars Dead and Alive. It's by Elizabeth McGreevy. So that's the next video I'm working on, where she basically talks about how Texas has effectively waged war on the cedar tree, and they're wrong. It's really bad that we're doing that, to be honest. And
everyone moves here and they think they're cedar trees
Yeah.
and not ash junipers, and start just clear cutting their land of them all.
Yeah,
I don't
no,
understand.
it's really interesting. The cedar thing's super interesting. The next, spoilers, like I said, the next video we're doing is going to be the cedar tree, just explicitly the cedar tree. I'm actually I'm not joking when I say that immediately after this podcast, I'm going to go have coffee with Elizabeth McCreevy to chat about this topic. But, working with the symbiosis guys, I didn't want to touch the cedar tree in their video because I was like, this needs to be its own separate. It's a huge rabbit hole, but like I can give the kind of the high level gist is essentially, and I'm sure you saw a lot of this in cedar choppers, was basically the cedar tree. And a lot of people's eyes, a lot of people think the cedar tree is not native. It is. It's 100% native. It's been here since at least the last ice age. It's far more native than any human is here, it's a lot of people think it's. There's kind of a couple misconceptions. They think it's not native. They think it soaks up all the water, it does cause allergies. That one's not a myth. But yeah, they think it soaks up all the water. They think it's a nuisance, which is partially true, but it's not necessarily the tree's fault. That it's not native. And so a lot of people think, okay, I buy land, I want to get all the water back, just cut it all down and it'll all come back.
Yeah, when I was a kid, that's what we were told.
And it's I don't blame people for it either, because that's it's one of these things where it's like
part of the culture at this point.
Well, it's culture, but it's also like, you don't necessarily expect somebody who's working land to just have such an in-depth, ecological knowledge of the ecosystems at play, right? Like they'll know the functional working relationships as they should more than anybody, but they're not going to necessarily understand the ramifications of like, oh, if I do this, what's going to happen in 60 years, right? And so basically what had happened is when the first European settlers arrived in Texas, basically the hill country the eastern part of the hill country was carpeted in like old growth, like forest of cedar. Like we're talking like proper trees, not the shrubs that we know as today as cedar, but like huge, tall cedars. They describe them as like a lot of people would like the old letters would literally describe them as like cathedrals, like being in the thickets, like because it wasn't like when we think cedar thickets now, it's like here you're like
it's like scrub brush.
It's impossible to navigate, that type of stuff. But now, back then it was way more like super tall, like you're walking through cathedrals and hallways of cedar.
Why has that changed?
So what happens is basically the Europeans get here. And so basically cedars, we know, super great fence posts, super resistant to rot. And especially the old growth stuff, it's super tall, it's super big. And even the old growth stuff is even better, more rot resistant, and like would last forever. So the frontiersmen get here, and of course, what are they going to do? They're going to use it, right? And so that's basically the early frontier of Texas was built on the back of cedar tree. And so they're building houses out of it, they're building tools out of it, and everything. And so what happens is they start clearing that. Not again, Texas at this time is so small, so they're not making remotely enough of a dent for it to matter. But essentially, over time, what happens is right around the 1880s, I believe, we start introducing like large amounts of grazing, right? And so basically, we push the buffalo out who were grazing here before, and then we bring in our own form of ranching and grazing. And that initially isn't the biggest deal because we don't have fences yet. And so that cattle's naturally roaming, and it's eating here, then it's eating there, and it's moving, and it's rotation, right? But what happens is right around the 1880s through 1900s, with the introduction of cattle and fencing, and then also what happens around that time is we start building a bunch of railroads, and we start building a bunch of telephone poles, and all this, and the industrialization of the United States starts. The cedar choppers, as they became to know, start coming in. A lot of them came from Appalachia, actually, just come in and start clear cutting the entire sets of like old growth cedar forests. And so basically, with all this industry and all this stuff gets cleared out. Then the cattle comes in, and then you start putting fences around them so they're not being rotated. They start overgrazing and killing the land, or basically eating all the grass. What happens is Texas topsoil is not very deep, especially in the hill country. It's very rocky. And we have extreme periods of drought and followed by extreme periods of flooding. So what happens is cattle comes in, cedar's been cleared out. Cattle comes in, eats all the grass that's protecting the topsoil, and then you have extreme periods of drought, which dry that out, and then rain comes in, a couple years later, extreme periods of wetness that just flushes it all out. And now you've basically just left this like useless kalish that I'm sure a lot of you have seen in certain fields where it's just like
barren.
You get grass like this and it's rocks and there's nothing, right? And so what the cedar tree is, the cedar tree basically was the quote almost the solution. People didn't realize and still don't realize this, but the cedar tree is the only thing that can basically grow there. And so the thing the cedar tree does is it'll go in. Cedar tree has no problem. I'm sure you guys have seen it, especially in the out in Barton Creek. Like you'll see like limestone boulders with cedar trees like growing right through the middle. Like they don't care. Like they will grow in any condition. And so what they do is they'll grow in there and they'll take over, and they basically form those thickets. Now, the thickets eventually, over a very long period of time, would turn into old growth. But the problem is, early on, those thickets, as you guys know, are just impassable and untouchable. What those thickets do, though, is they, over time, those nettles, or the pine needles, whatever they're called, fall. That builds soil. Underneath, those roots protect erosion from wind, rain, water, whatever. And they provide cover, and that's where post oaks and other species start to pop up. So it brings biodiversity back. The problem is that, right around the 1920s, 1910s, Austin starts to gain population, and people are like, "Why do we have allergies all the time?" It's the cedars' fault because it's true. Cedars do cause our allergies, but so do oak and other trees. I don't know why the cedar gets an unfair rap on that, but. Basically, the cedar trees, people are just start demonizing the cedar tree because they're like, it's giving us allergies. Let's just get rid of it, right? Early 20th century, people don't necessarily have the smartest or most well-educated opinions on dealing with plant or animal species in general. The general like, let's just kill all of them; it'll be fine. So that happens, and then basically now you start having. The cedar tree originally was super respected, right? Because it was like super rot resistant, super easy to build with, super, useful. Then it kind of got all clear cut, kind of became an afterthought. That wasn't hated, but they kind of just like, whatever, it's gone, who cares? Then the ones that were left were causing allergies, so people start hating on them. And then by basically the 60s, what happens is that people, there's a lot of push against the allergen piece, and then studies start to come out, or at least a study, I should say, comes out saying that cedar trees use more water than oak trees.
That's what I've always heard, that it choked the oak trees.
That study, I don't want to give numbers because I don't want to give people the wrong stuff here. I will say that study has been debunked. Like I said, I highly recommend go read Elizabeth McGreevy's work if you want like all the super high details on this. Her book's amazing. But essentially... the study is debunked now, but it basically alleged that cedar trees use almost double the water that post oaks do. And so again, people were like, we need water, we're in drought. So what do? We cut all the cedar trees. And again, like you guys know, like that's still prevalent to this day. That's not true. And basically that kind of starts that. And then there's one more piece to all this, which is basically that I think it was in the 80s and 90s, the golden cheek warbler, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but a very famous endangered bird species here, exclusively uses Central Texas hill country cedar thickets as its nesting habitat. So in the 90s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service basically came in and said, we need to protect, I don't remember the exact number, I think they said like 300,000 acres or something of habitat across the entire hill country. That got misreported as we're going to buy everything in this 300,000 acres and turn it into a wildlife habitat. As I'm sure you guys know, Texas landowners, if there's one thing you don't want to tell them to do, it's tell them what to do with their land. And so basically what happened is you have this kind of like basically misunderstanding of what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wants to do. Also, there's laws and regulations now about you can't cut cedars down within a certain percentage or whatever because you need to protect the habitat. So now you basically have these trees that landowners have been told is sucking all their water up and is just a nuisance that they can't cut down because the government's telling them they can't. And now they're hearing that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to buy some insane number of land, including their land potentially, to turn into wildlife habitat. And so that just further like pours gasoline on a fire and kind of incites people against this tree. And for whatever reason, the kind of people that are saying like, hey, none of this is true, like it's actually beneficial, it's just not breaking through. And that kind of led us to where we're at today, where, you know, a lot of people to this day still think cedar trees, like the answer is to get rid of all of them, cut them all down. The answer is not that. The answer isn't also just leave all of them either. Like, to be totally transparent, like, again, I don't want to speak to their expertise on this. Adam and Michael and the guys from Symbiosis would be way better people to give you the real ins and outs of what they do on the land with cedars and how they manage that. But essentially, you know, where it's going to net out is effectively that the answer to cedar trees is never to just clear cut all of them. It completely depends on your property, the conditions of your property, and what you're trying to do with your property. Because like all things, there's never a one size fits all solution, right? But if the answer to basically, the long story short is, like, you buy property, please don't just cut all your cedars down. Mm-hmm. Find somebody who's really like knowledgeable in permaculture or ecology or just Texas hill country landscapes in general, and they'll be able to give you like a really in-depth kind of game plan for how you can accomplish whatever it is you want to accomplish with your land. And I promise you, it will not entail cutting every single one of your cedars down, because what will happen is all your soil will be gone in 5 years. And the only way it's ever going to come back is by basically either a lot of permaculture or letting the cedars take over again. So, you know, we're at this point now where I think the pendulum's finally starting to swing the other way. At least maybe I'm a little biased because I'm just like in the weeds with this. Like, it's such a ridiculous, like I cannot stress how overwhelmingly in-depth this topic is. Like, when I started this video concept with Adam from Symbiosis, I was like, I want to make this video. I have some opinions on it, whatever, and I think it'll be really cool. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. And like, he's been sending me like entire conferences that go on in Austin that are just about the cedar tree. Like 20 hours of footage of like 30 different people with various forms of degrees from all over the state with like 40 years of research talking about nothing but the dang cedar tree. That's and then crazy. It's like, this book is like 500 pages of just the cedar tree. Wow. And it's just like, this tree is like, that's kind of where I was like, okay, we need to make this video, but I'm also kind of like, can I curse?
Oh yeah. Of
okay,
course.
Cool. Making sure. I'm like, shit, dude. Like, do I want to make this video?
It's kind of a lot of pressure. You
yeah.
know?
Well, and it's not just that, like to show you how pervasive it is. Like in my, like if you go look at the comments on my hill country video where we don't even mention the cedars, like we just kind of, we like briefly are like cedars there. People are just like, these guys are idiots. They just need to cut. These guys they're fake. They're whatever. They're like, all they have to do is cut all the cedar down. And I'm like, no, like, come on, guys. Like the amount of comments where people are just like, yeah, we do permaculture too. We cut all our cedars down. Like, it's just like the amount of people there, and there are people angry, like genuinely angry with me and the Symbiosis team because we don't say you need to cut your cedars down. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, holy crap, guys, it's just a tree. Relax, dude. Like, but that's how, pervasive it is. So yeah, that's why it became the next topic. And I cannot, like, if it's, again, I can't stress enough, it is such a rabbit hole to go down, and it is such a fascinating rabbit hole because it's just a tree, but there's so much history to it, and there's so much emotion around it. So hopefully I do a good job. Hopefully I don't just get absolutely roasted alive. I don't think I will. I've got plenty of support from the right people, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to say the least. So
absolutely, I'm very, very much looking forward to when that drops. Do you have any sort of ETA and when you think that video might come out?
Well, so the original hope was end of August, but as I said, as the more I read about this, the more I'm like, shit, dude. How long is this movie? How long is this film going to be? Yeah. So I'm hoping end of August, trying to stay on my one a month timeline, but it is one of those things too where it's like I don't want to perpetuate more bad information too. So like I'm really doing due diligence, and it's like when somebody says XYZ, I'm like, okay, cool. Like what's the counter argument to that? And trying my best to just like make sure what I'm saying in this is correct and true. Because a lot of this story is built on the fact that back of people just seeing one thing and instantly making an observation and stating that as truth, when in actuality, it's a very complicated system. So yeah, like I said, hope is into this month.
there's a chance it could go to September, but I'm hoping into this month. So, yeah.
Through your research so far, have you found any, legitimate scientists or researchers that do disagree with the notion that cedar trees are native? I mean, are there people out there that have legitimate backgrounds pushing back on that?
I haven't found anybody with like a formal academic background that has come out in favor recently and basically said, yes, cut all the cedars down. Mm-hmm. Where I have seen like disagreement, at least in my research, is more so on the scope and scale of controlling cedar. But at least the consensus in my experience has just been, cutting them all down is not the solution. They're not evil. They're not non-native. They're from Texas. They're an important part of the ecosystem. They're actually very beneficial. I think really a lot of the debate just comes more along the lines of like, okay, here's your property, or like here's a 500-acre parcel. Like, how exactly should you approach this the control and movement and cutting? That's at least been my experience that I've discovered. But again, we'll see what happens by the time I make the film. So that's actually a question I had wanted to ask Elizabeth later today too, was like, she's done more research than I'll ever be able to do on this topic. And it's basically like, what's her experience been working with academics? So yeah, it's a great question though.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
So when you look at Texas history, is there a segment in time that you find the most interesting?
Yeah, I honestly, for me, it's everything from 18, like the 1820s, 30s, like pre-Texas Revolution up until the Civil War, I think is really fascinating to me because, I should say through the 1900s, because I think we have this really rosy, that's what one of the videos I did was like, we have this really rosy idea of what the Republic of Texas was. We were like, there's like, here's this huge map. It's this crazy big, only what if Texas had, been able to hold on to all this, whatever. But it's like, if you really look at like the Texas Republic and what had happened, like it sounds terrible to say, but I'm just like, dude, how did Mexico lose to this? Like, what happened? The answer is because Santa Anna, another guy who's a rabbit hole. Like, if you've never read about the biographies of Santa Anna, go read the biography of Santa Anna. That dude is one of the most interesting people in history. I think he was president of Mexico like 12 times, most of that non-consecutively. Like, also the guy that brought chiclets and chewing gum to the U.S. Just one of the most interesting people you could ever meet up. Anyways, I digress. That area is that whole area is really interesting to me because basically, like, you have all of these foreign powers kind of meddling with Texas, right? So, like, you have all these people coming to Texas for a new start, whatever reason, right? Texas is pretty inhospitable, to be honest, west of kind of the eastern part of the state.
And that was due to Native Americans. I mean, I'm about...
Well, it's both. It's both Native Americans, right? The Comanche are obviously, like, when it comes to, like, the most badass group of Native Americans in American history, it's Comanche. Like, even after Texas was annexed, like, the U.S. was fighting them, I think, well through the, like, 1860s, 1870s. And they held their own. Like, they were, they were legit, basically.
Well, I know the Spanish. I'm a few dozen pages into Empire of the Summer Moon. Talking about this, and it was describing that the Spanish kind of liked the European settlers coming in because they created a buffer.
100%.
For the Comanches, they were so brutal.
I mean, so like, the Comanche, like, there's a famous raid. Like, the Comanche would like in Matagorda Bay, where Port O'Connor and Port Lavaca are nowadays. One of the first like ports on that part of the bay, which became like a major bay in Texas history, was Linville, and the Comanche literally like raided. Their territory was like Austin and West. They literally like went through all of Texas down to Linville, completely sacked, raided it, burned to the ground, and then went back. They were a legit like major issue for like the burgeoning colony. You have that, but then you also have like the environment too. Like, I mean, the hill country, even back when it was more carpeted with forest or whatever, there's a lot of resources, but I mean, your severe drought or your severe flood, neither are necessarily great for agriculture. And so basically you have all this, and then you have like European powers meddling. Like, obviously you have the whole Mexican-Texas stuff. And even after, I don't think people realize this, but when Texas won its revolution, like, Mexico didn't just go like, okay, you win, see you later. Like Mexico was still raiding as far as San Antonio well after the revolution ended. So basically, you have basically what's happening during all this is like you have all these people coming to the state from all over the world, who aren't necessarily like culturally like aligned. I should say aligned maybe the wrong word, but basically like you have Germans, you have Swedes, you have Americans, you have Mexicans, you have people from everywhere just coming in, and they're all setting up their own colonies out in the middle of nowhere. And then you have Mexico, who's like very angry that Texas took their colony from them, understandably, and so they're still kind of messing with Texas, and they're plotting their revenge during all of this. You have Texas as a republic. You have like two factions inside, where you have like Mirabeau Lamar and his group, where like Texas can succeed as a nation. We can hold our own. And they're like, there's like if you guys have ever heard of the Santa Fe expedition, where Mirabeau Lamar basically tried to invade New Mexico at one point. It was a disaster, absolute disaster. They basically got arrested the moment they got there. But we have that, and then you also have Sam Houston and his side of the government, where they're basically like, no, we need to be annexed by somebody. I don't care who, but somebody like ASAP. So you have like that internal stuff, and then the U.S. doesn't want to annex Texas because during all of this is what the slave rights issues are going on, and they don't want to add states because they don't want to upset the balance. So there's all those politics. And then Texas is like, okay, you guys aren't going to annex, so we're going to go to Belgium and France and London, the UK, to try and get you guys to give us some kind of support, something, anything. So like, there's a Texan embassy. There was a Texan embassy in London that you.
Wow, was there?
Yeah. So if you ever go to London, I don't think you can go inside. It was literally like a three room like hallway basically. But yeah,
is it still there? The building that
I think there's just a marker now. I don't think there's like an actual building, but yeah, there's like a marker where like this used to be the Texan embassy or whatever. So like there's there's all that stuff, and it's just like this really fascinating time. And then like also during all this, like the Germans with the Adelsverein were like, cool, like let's go start a German colony in Texas. So that's where all New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, all those guys came in through the Adelsverein, which was like a committee in Prussia that were basically like shipping people to Matagorda Bay via Indianola up in, and that's how the hill country kind of got its German identity. And then of course, like that whole period from like 1830 through like 1890 is just like a whirlwind for Texas, because you go from unchecked, untouched, just like rugged, I don't want to call it a hellscape, but just like very hard place to live, to now it's just like everybody from all over the world's moving here, and there's all these factions involved, and they're all fighting either physically or diplomatically with each other over stuff. And then, of course, you have the Czechs who come in the 1870s, mostly after the Civil War, too, that just take over large parts of the state. I shouldn't take over, not like physically take over, but like inhabit large parts of the state. So to me, that's like really interesting, because that whole period is like effectively like that is where the state's cultural identity really forms, is between like 1830 and like 1890, because obviously the Texas Revolution, which is a huge part of the cultural identity, but then it's like the Czechs, the Germans, like just everything that kind of comes to shape the state happens in that 50, 60 year time period, which is crazy because that's one lifetime, right? Like imagine you're 10 years old or whatever, and you come to Texas and right after the revolution or during the revolution, and then, you die in like 1890, 1900, and now electricity or steam's been invented. There's railroads moving across the state, and, there's like Austin has a giant, fancy capital when, Austin didn't even exist like conceptually at the start of the revolution, right? So yeah, just crazy period of change for the state.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such a fascinating time in Texas history. And I know, again, just because of the book I'm reading right now, but I know for like 40 years of that, I think starting around the 30s was, the wars we basically had with the Comanches and the constant threat of that. And I was thinking about that a lot reading the book, just like imagining living in a time that you have the thought of, raids happening or, the Spanish coming up. I mean, it's just such a, why would you live here?
Yeah, no, 100%.
Time period,
Well, and it's like you have the greater chain of Comanche and some extent Apache wars that happened during all that. And then you have obviously the Texas Revolution. And then only 20 years later, Texas then fights in the Civil War. Granted, Texas wasn't as involved in the Civil War as most of the Deep South was, where we were obviously involved and we had battles throughout the state, but it wasn't anywhere near as crazy as the Deep South part. But, it's just like, just the change to go from colony of Texas or colony of Mexico, sorry, colony of Mexico to independent republic to annexed by the U.S. to being a rebel faction within the U.S. to back to being a part of the U.S. all in the span of like 30, 40 years. Like, and then the whole time you're also fighting Native Americans and also the state, it's like the state's natural environment itself to just survive. It's like, yeah, dude, people that grew up in that time were some tough sons of bitches. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Like, those guys were hardcore. Like, it's tough. Like, I you know, one of the videos, this is a video that may or may not come out because I kind of gave up on it a little bit, but I tried to do a video in Indianola. I don't know if you guys know about Indianola, but basically Matagorda Bay, there's Port Lava. Are you guys familiar with Matagorda Bay at all?
So I grew up going fishing at Port O'Connor.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
actually there last weekend. I'm going again this weekend.
Yeah. I've got family that live there. So.
It's a great little fishing town. And so my only knowledge of Indianola is I think there's a lake right there, and there's some cabins you can rent right on the mouth of it. Yep. And so that's about the extent of my knowledge.
So you have Port O'Connor here. We're gonna get real deep into Texas geography here. But
Ransom, would you pull up a map of that area? If you don't mind, just look up Port O'Connor. For people listening, if you tune in on the video, you can see what we're looking at.
Yeah, I'll try and explain it as much as possible to on the Google Maps.
But yeah, so like Matagorda Bay to me, like I'll also give more spoilers about my channel. Like there will be a point in the near future, I haven't picked it yet, where I'm literally just going to go spend like a week down in Port O'Connor, because Matagorda Bay is like one of the most slept on historical parts of the state of Texas. Like people don't understand the amount of like formative and important history that's happened here.
Interesting.
So basically right there where, good old Clark's, that's where my uncles dock their boat. Oh, yeah. But okay, so you want to zoom out just a little bit. So that's Port O'Connor right there, right? So Port O'Connor is on the left side of the bay. So the main thing about Matagorda Bay is that's where the Colorado River estuary ends. And so just up the road from Port O'Connor, I say up the road, there's no road, but just up the peninsula, or just up the bay from Port O'Connor is Indianola. And so I guess at a high level, I'll talk about Matagorda. So basically Matagorda is the first place that the French land when the French had their ill-fated expedition to Texas. So more towards Jackson County, the Jackson County side of Matagorda Bay is where LaSalle and his expedition land. And they set up their fort. It is an absolute disaster. There's a famous story that I don't know if it's true because I've never fact-checked it, but I've heard that like they brought cannons and cannonballs, but the cannonballs were too big for the cannons. Like that's how poorly the expedition went. So they just had all this dead weight. But anyways, they showed up like the LaSalle expedition. It's really interesting. They pulled the LaBelle, which is one of the three ships, up. That's the boat that's at the bottom of the Bob Bullock Museum.
So, so in the bay here?
Yeah. So they pulled that up, I think, in the 90s or early 2000s. So if you go to the Bob Bullock Museum, the boat that you see when you walk in now, the first exhibit that they've like restored and is in there, that's the boat that they pulled out of Matagorda Bay.
And that you said that was from which country?
That was the French expedition. Yeah.
Okay.
So the French were like, hey, we want to get on this Texas thing. This is pre-Texas as a colony, so to speak. This is like when it was just the Spanish, like super loose control. They show up, and within like 2 years or whatever, they all get run off or die. It's a disaster. But so that's like one big thing that happens here. But basically Port O'Connor's there, where Indianola is now. So when the Aldosverein, which is the German-Prussian group that was sending immigrants to Texas immediately after its revolution, was over, that's where they picked. So basically they sent a guy to scout, and they wanted a spot in Texas that was kind of literally completely untouched and unchecked by Europeans, settlers. They wanted or Americans. So that's why I didn't use Galveston, because they wanted to send like straight up, like, I still don't fully understand. I need to do more research on it. I don't know the full reason why they didn't want them to be like untainted or whatever by American and European settlers. But basically they wanted them to like get there, go straight into the hill country in Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, whatever, and like have as little interaction with Americans and Texans Europeans as possible. I guess just to preserve the German culture or something. I don't know. Germany was like super nationalistic at this time. So, but they pick Indianola, and so Indianola becomes the major port. And so when they first get to Indianola, it's a shithole. Like it's literally like I'm sure as you know, like Powderhorn Lake and all that which by the way will become the next state park if you guys didn't know, which is super awesome.
I
But
remember hearing about that. I forgot that it was right there.
yeah, so that whole area southeast of Indianola now, where it says Powder, that whole area that's just like empty, just north of Port O'Connor, shit is all going to become a state park.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, as you know, like it's all just bayou swamp out there.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing. There's no trees, nothing out there.
Is it for the historical reasons that they're making it a state park, or do you know why that?
I think it was because there's a single family that owns that whole tract, and I think when they passed or they moved on, they donated it, or the state
very
bought
cool.
it, something like that. I don't
Okay.
know the exact
I
details.
need to look up the history on that.
But basically, Indianola is like where all those guys are coming in, and so they start building a port there. And so basically, at this time, you've got Port Lavaca. It wasn't called Port Lavaca; it was just called like Lavaca, I think, at this time. In Indianola, Lavaca was the original kind of port there, but Lavaca has issues with sandbars. Indianola doesn't. So they started building harbor keys and stuff like that. And the Morgan and something company out of New York, I can't remember the name, and I think it's the same Morgan from J.P. Morgan. I could be wrong, so don't 100% quote me on that. But basically, New York money kind of catches wind of like this new port in Texas, Indianola, and starts putting money into it. So now steamer lines start running from Galveston, New Orleans, and Indianola. And Indianola starts becoming like one of the major ports in the state of Texas. And by the time of the Civil War, Indianola is second only to Galveston in terms of its like importance to the state of Texas. There's like 5 harbor keys. Like there's constant ship traffic. It's the U.S. Army's using it as its main thoroughfare into the Texas frontier, right? Because Galveston's so much further east. It's only 100 miles up the road, or I shouldn't say up the road, up the coast, but it's so much further. It's 100 miles east, right? Whereas Indianola, you can get in and go straight. And so like the U.S. Army's using it for all of their importation of all the stuff for the frontier. There's like
so they were actually coming into Indianola there and then getting out onto the land and going up. So they weren't even going further up the bay. I mean, they're coming out right there.
Yeah, basically. So in fact, Port Lavaca used to be the seat of Calhoun County, and then they moved it to Indianola. That's how like important Indianola came, is that it actually usurped Port Lavaca. Of course, now it's back in Port Lavaca, and I'll get to that in a second. But Indianola is like this hugely important, massively important port. There's basically like there's a lot of talks about building railroads. From no joke, they wanted to build like roads and railroads from Indianola all the way to San Diego, because they're like, this is going to become like the marquee port on the Texas coast to like access like the western part of the country. Because again, this is before the Panama Canal. Like the only way to get from east to the west side via boat is to go all the way around. So like if we can get to Galveston or Indianola by water, it's a lot cheaper than train. And then we can take a train over the relatively flat land, because you can go underneath the Rockies, right? Because Arizona, New Mexico, it's all just flat.
So at this time, how big is Galveston in the Houston area when this Indianola port was large?
I don't know the exact numbers of Galveston. Galveston was still by far the most important. And Galveston was actually way bigger than Houston. I think that's the thing people don't understand, is that Galveston grew way before Houston did. Galveston was one of the most important places in the entire state because it was the port for the state of Texas. And so Galveston, I don't know the exact population numbers.
Indianola might have been second to Galveston?
Yeah, Indianola was definitely second, right. And so Indianola is huge. It's super important. But then 2 things happen. So, it's funny, their relationship with Galveston too, because obviously we all know about the 1900 Galveston hurricane, right? It's still the most deadly natural disaster in U.S. history, where it basically... It's the reason Galveston's like 3 or 4 or 5 feet up on a seawall now, is because it just wiped the town out. So Indianola, I can't remember the dates off the top of my head. I apologize, but the first one I think is in like 1872 or something. Basically, a hurricane comes in 145 mile per hour winds and just completely obliterates the town. Completely obliterates.
We're talking Indianola?
Indianola.
Okay, yeah.
And as you know, you've been to Port O'Connor, like. That area, even like the Texas barrier islands, are just flat. There is no break. There's no shelter from anything. And so they had thought the bay and the barrier islands were going to protect them, because Galveston's on the barrier island. So that's why if it gets hit with a hurricane, it's in mega trouble. And they thought, okay, Indianola is in the bay. The barrier islands will break the surge, whatever, and we'll be able to weather a storm. And so basically that comes in and just completely obliterates the city. I think there's like 5 buildings left, like 500 people are dead or something. And instantly all the money out of New York and the Northeast is like out. We're like, okay, this is not the promised like safe port we thought it was. We're out of here. And so instantly Indianola goes from being like one of the most important ports in the state to being like, okay, what do we do now? Like all of the money out of this place is gone. The town's destroyed. What do we do? So people start leaving and going other places. Nobody wants to put money in here anymore because they just got destroyed by a hurricane. And so they rebrand as like a resort town for like Victoria and like the elite of Houston, whatever. And then that kind of goes okay. And then I think another one in like 1880, even stronger than the first, comes in and just wipes it off the face of the planet completely. And so if you zoom in on Indianola, the thing is like, to understand how shallow the bays are and like how devastating it was, that's Powderhorn Lake. The idea, I don't want to move too far away from the lake, but basically where Indianola is now is actually 300 feet off of where it was. So the actual, like all the foundations, the courthouse, everything are 200 to 300 feet into the water.
Oh, wow.
So some of that's just due to natural erosion and time, right? But like if you were to go 200 so feet off the rocks now, that's where a lot of the foundations were. And it was also kind of more southeast too, kind of more towards the lake. And so, nowadays you look at Indianola and you're like, why the hell did they ever build a port here? Because it's literally just bay here and then bayou on the other side. So if there's ever flooding of any kind, it's all gone. But yeah, so that's like, to me, like Indianola and that area is just a crazy, crazy area. And the other thing too, this is a video, again, I'll go spoilers here. This is like my dream film that I want to do this year, is Matagorda Island just off the coast. I'm sure you're familiar with Port O'Connor. That island too, I don't think people realize the amount of history out there too. Like Matagorda is crazy. So on Matagorda Island here, right across the way,
I don't know much about it. I mean, I love fishing those jetties right there on the boat.
A little southwest. It's not these two. It's just the one southwest. But you'll see, keep going. So you'll see there's an airfield here. So there's two airfields on Matagorda Island. So this island's crazy. So there is there's an old lighthouse. Yeah, that one right there. That's been there since before the Civil War.
Wow.
There's a lot of stories about how basically, like, this was before the Civil War. And then during the Civil War, like the Union and Confederate armies, navies, whatever, changed hands on this like 400 times or whatever. Not actually 400, probably like 4 times, but basically constantly back and forth. Like, and again, we're talking like there's like 30 dudes on this, and then like 30 Union guys show up and kick them off, and then 30 more Confederate. We're not talking like huge engagements, like literally just like 15 dudes fighting each other, but. The Union get on.
Shooting each other or fist fighting?
Shooting each other. Usually not even shooting each other. It's more like the Union ships would show up and the Confederates were like, all right, see you guys later. We're going out. And then the Union would go do something else somewhere else and the Confederates would just come back. Like,
take it back over?
Yeah, basically just changing hands. But yeah, so that lighthouse, like the Unions tried to blow it up. They couldn't because it's like wrought iron or whatever. There's 2 airfields on here going into World War II history. That airfield right there... is one of the airfields that was used by the U.S. Navy as one of its dive bombing facilities. So basically, they would fly out from the airport. I forget the name, and something field in Victoria, and then they would land here, and then they would do dive bombing practice runs. So like a lot of the like naval pilots that ended up in the Pacific Front did training here out on Matagorda Bay. And we're taking off from these airfields. There's another one further up east, but then if you keep going southwest from Matagorda, there's the island airstrip right there. And this one's super interesting too, because if you zoom in on it, this was another airstrip. This one, I believe, was another Navy Army facility. It's a lot smaller, but those ponds and whatnot, there used to be an oil tycoon that lived out here. And this is where his property was. He lived out here full time. And to put the context, the like importance of that family, whatever you want to call it, like the Roosevelts, like I believe FDR and his family, the presidential yacht actually docked in Matagorda Bay. They never set foot on the island, but the family met with the presidential family on the presidential yacht in that bay. And the reason they were there is because tarpon fishing was like all the rage back in. And so Matagorda Bay has a lot of tarpon. And so there's that. And then the other piece on this too is that eventually that airstrip was there in the 90s. I think the first ever private / commercial space operation launched the first ever commercial space rocket from that airstrip. So, because again, if you think about where it is relative to like NASA and whatnot in Cape Canaveral, it's the same. And the reason they're in Cape Canaveral is because there's a giant body of water east, because you launch rockets east. Well, there you go. It's the same thing. You have the giant Gulf to your east. So that's why, Elon's down in South Texas, because if, something goes wrong, it's going wrong over the ocean, and you're near the equator. So that's just some of the history that's going on Matagorda Island. Like that whole bay, that whole area is just, there's just so much. Like you can't go more than 10 feet. If you go there, you wouldn't know it by looking at it. As you know, it's like, it's very quiet. It's very peaceful. It doesn't seem like there's a lot going on, but you can't go more than, 100 yards without running into something of importance out there. Wow. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, like Matagorda for me is like that. Like I could go there for 2 weeks and shoot like 5 videos. Wow. Easily. So,
is coastal Texas, for history purpose, your favorite part of?
Yeah, coastal Texas. I think coastal Texas is probably my favorite part of Texas in general. It's not exactly the most. I shouldn't say that. I still prefer the hill country, but I love coastal Texas. I think it's underrated. Like I think people rag on Texas too much when it comes to the beach. Like don't get me wrong. Like I'm not going to Port O'Connor to go to the beach per se to like swim or whatever. Right? Like it's not going to touch Florida or the Caribbean, but there's the grasslands and the barrier islands. Like the barrier islands, if you've never spent time on the barrier islands on foot, are some of the most gorgeous pieces of the state. Matagorda Island, if people didn't know, you can camp there. It's not a national park. It's I think it's a state park. I don't know what the technical, you can camp there. You just have to have somebody take you there. You can't drive there. You can only get there by boat. But it is completely available to camp. And like Matagorda Island, like when we were kids in Port O'Connor, I don't think people go here anymore, but there's a place called Sunday Beach. And it's basically where one of the inlets on Matagorda Island hits close to the other side of the island. So you basically have like the bay here, and then you have like the Gulf on the other side. Short. Oh, nice. And we would go there like all day. You can actually see it right there, Sunday Beach. So
you'd have to get out there with a boat.
Basically. Yeah, correct. Yeah, the only way you could get there is with boat. But basically, like that was kind of my first exposure out there, and it's gorgeous. Don't go there in the summer. Like if you're going to camp, do not go to the Barrier Islands in the summer. Don't go there in the winter either, because there's no cover. It's freezing cold and it's miserable. But if you go there in the spring or fall when the weather's nice, yeah, it's just stunning. I mean, you have all the tall native grasses, the bayous.
What's wrong with summertime there?
It's just hot and mosquitoes, because it's all bayou out there. Again, there's no cover. There's no trees out there. It's all shrubs like this tall and native grass. So you've got snakes and mosquitoes, and it's just oppressive heat. And then it reflects off that, the sand and the rock out there is pretty white. So it's just oppressive. So yeah, it's just I could spend so much time in the Barrier Islands, and there's so much history too. I mean, like if you look at the state, it makes sense. Like before the invention of planes, the easiest way to get stuff to places was boat. So Texas has the longest chain of barrier islands in the country. It makes sense that naturally that's where a lot of the history of the state is born and formative from. So yeah.
We had on Jay and Chrissy Clayberg that are producing a film called Chasing the Tide, where they walk the whole coastline, and I grew up fishing there, but I knew very little of, kind of like the environmental issues going on there, and then let alone the history itself. And so it was fun talking with them, and I didn't realize the whole thing, is like an easement or something, so you can really walk the whole thing legally, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's the longest. Yeah, you can basically go from South Padre all the way to I don't remember exactly where it ends up by Houston, but you can go the whole way. Obviously, there's some channel cuts and whatnot now that you'd have to cross, usually with kayak. I'm not sure what they did. I would imagine kayak or swam.
They had help, so people would come and kayak across, and or take an airboat or something.
But you can see there's some that are cut and some are natural. But yeah, like if you go to Padre Island, Padre Island is, I believe, the longest contiguous barrier island in the U.S., if not the world. I could be wrong about the world, but I do know it's one of the longest in the world. Wow. So South Padre has one break, and then it hits Padre just north, and I don't know the exact number of how far it runs, but yeah, it's crazy, crazy long. So I think people sleep on the coast, and I understand it too. Like it's not exactly what you think of when you think of beaches. And then also like it's just naturally where all the oil industry is at. So, you kind of have to drive through all the plants and all that to kind of get there, which isn't exactly the most picturesque or necessarily pleasant. But I think especially when you get to little hidden gems like Port O'Connor and stuff like that, it's just like a whole like different slice of Texas, and time slows down there for me at least.
Absolutely.
So it's
something about those just little coastal towns in Texas are special. And I personally love to rag on Texas beaches in a fun way, just because, I don't like going to the Texas beaches in the summer. And if you go fall or spring or even winter, they're so nice. And it's great. You can have a nice warm day in the fall or the spring and go swim, and it's great. But I used to go to Port Aransas as a kid, and when you're a kid, it's great. As an adult, it's less great, in my opinion. I went like a couple summers ago, and like it was just so hot. The water was like bath water. I felt like it was sticky. Just not a great time, but fall or spring, I'm all for it.
Yeah, my family and I went to Port Aransas, I think last year I think it was like the first week of October or something. Fantastic.
That was perfect.
It was perfect. It was like 85, just warm enough, but also because it was October, was not crowded. It was so much better than going in like prime, like June, July.
Absolutely. Well, what have we missed? Dylan, what else do we need to talk about? What other cool Texas history you got for us?
I could, there's so much stuff everywhere you look, man. But, I think one thing that's, I can even cheat. I'll cheat. I've got, so you can try to talk about my creative process a little bit while I cheat. But basically, the way we come up with our topics is like we have a giant, what's called a Miro board. Basically, imagine like a Post-it board. And what on that Miro board, basically me and my friend Tim, just like anytime we have any idea of any kind, it's just post a note onto the board. And basically, it's divided into two axes. It's ease versus difficulty, and broad versus niche.
Interesting.
And so basically, it's all a little subjective. But we basically go in, and anytime I have an idea, I just go, okay, stick it on the board. 90% of these will never get touched. 90 of these will never get used. But that's where some of these come from, is basically just like I'm driving somewhere, I see a historical marker, I read about it, bang, done. Let's see. I will say, going back to Indianola, one funny thing about shooting in small town Texas has always been it's really challenging, actually, and kind of scary at times. I know, for example, when I tried to shoot the Indianola video, I'm not joking, within 10 seconds of the drone going up, I had a person like in my face, like had walked out of their house, crossed the street, found me, and was just like, "Hey man, what are you doing?" And I was just like, "Oh, I'm just
on you.
yeah, exactly." And it was a very strange interaction because I get it. They're wondering who this guy is out here in the middle of nowhere, basically with a drone. And I was basically like, "Yeah, I'm just making a film about Indianola," and it was just like they just like interrogate you, and it's just I've run into this a couple times.
What was that guy cooking in his house?
He was definitely missing some teeth, I'll tell you that. Yeah. So I will say another video we're working on, which is really cool, is the Balcones Canyonlands. Are you guys familiar with the Balcones Canyonlands?
Yeah, like the preserve itself.
Well, so it's the preserve and then the National Wildlife Refuge. So, well, I say working on it. I'm trying to work on it. Okay. So we are in contact with a couple groups. It's a little difficult. Not their fault. It's obviously owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up in Williamson County. So in order to shoot out there like we want to, we have to get federal permission, which, as you imagine, is a lot of red tape. A whole song and dance.
The BCP is pretty fascinating. I think there's something like 30,000 acres protected just in Travis County.
Oh, yeah. Like so I believe the way the BCP works and the BCWR is that basically, again, actually going to the cedar tree, it's funny how this is all connected, but the warbler habitat was getting destroyed. And so what happened was the, Fish and Wildlife Service and other groups were like, we need to protect the habitats. And so they were like in Williamson and Travis and a little bit of Burnett too, I believe. They were like, we need to what eventually happened was they basically signed into law this thing where over the course of X amount of years, they needed to purchase and protect 70,000 or 80,000 acres across all three counties. And so I think 30,000 of that is in Travis and another 40 is up in Williamson and Burnett.
Holy cow.
But a lot of people know, what's funny is a lot of people don't realize some of the stuff in Austin is the BCP.
Mm-hmm.
We just think of the Greenbelt and we just think of like Hamilton Pool and stuff. But a lot of that is all part of the preserve. And there's actually a lot of preserve land that you can't access.
Most of it. I mean, I think the vast majority of it you can't access.
Correct. Well, especially in Travis, but even more so in Williamson. Like in Williamson, there are 3 access points to the entire 40,000 acres.
Is that the one in Lago when it goes to like Doeskin Ranch, Warbler Vista, and those areas? Yeah. I've spent a ton of time hiking there. I have very mixed emotions on it because on one hand, I love that the land's protected in perpetuity and it's, gives, the native nesting grounds for the bird. But at the same time, we're limited on public accessible land in this part of the area, and state parks are hard to get into these days. And so for me, I wish there was some level, or at least in the off season, some level of access. I have very mixed emotions on it.
No, this is something too that I've always thought, because growing up in the northern suburbs, I didn't even know the wildlife refuge existed. And if you haven't been to the trail, Indian Grass Trail, I think is what it's called, up by Liberty Hill.
That's one of my favorite ones when you go up the big hill and you come
like
out the back.
It's like a vertical straight climb up almost. Like one of the more vertical climbs you're going to get out here. And then you get out there and it's just vistas. Everywhere you look, it's just vistas of like the canyon lands. Unreal. And I didn't even know that stuff existed out there. And then it's like you can look on Google Maps and see even deeper into the canyon lands. And you're like, holy crap, that must be insanely gorgeous. Like talking to some of the groups out there, I know there are caves with like water in them and all sorts of crazy features that go on out there. I agree. I think it's awesome that like that habitat's protected, but I agree with you. Like, I wish there was a way that we could experience that a little more.
But they're very protective of it too. Yeah, they take it very serious.
Oh, very serious. Yeah. That's why I was like on this one. I'm like I can't go rogue on this one. Like I'm not going to go out there with a drone because they're not allowed. Yeah. And just kind of send it because like I would like to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the future. Yeah. So let's not burn bridges on day one. But it's really interesting. But it's also like, to me, it's really, what I find really interesting about it is a lot of people don't know about it. But part of me wonders if that's on purpose, even if unintentionally on purpose, of like, if the less people know about it, the less people are going to try and break rules and go out there. But then on the flip side, like the Fish and Wildlife Service only has so much funding for that land, and a lot of additional funding comes through nonprofit and private donation. So there is an element of like, I think where they have to straddle is this line of, okay, we need to protect this land and keep people from doing stupid shit on it, but also we still need people to like know about it and care about it enough to like help us support and maintain it. So it's really interesting. There's actually a couple wildlife refuges scattered around the state. I don't think people really, it's one of those things I don't think people really know about as wildlife refuges. So there's like a Ranzis National Wildlife Refuge, which is like basically just a whole section of Texas coast that's protected. And then there's a couple more scattered around, but it's, I want to do a film on it so bad because it's so gorgeous and it's so pretty. But that's kind of the issue I run into is basically, I kind of run into this a lot with Texas. I think speaking holistically, you would think it'd be really easy to shoot stuff. A lot of times it's not because of one of two things. Either if it is, a lot of stuff is not publicly accessible. And if it is publicly accessible, or I shouldn't say publicly accessible. A lot of it's not publicly accessible because either A, it's privately owned, which is 90% of the case, or B, the state/government own it, but they're super protective of it because it's the only little bit of land they have that's not a state park that they need to protect for environmental habitats. So this is something that I have to contend with a lot with filming, is basically like, again, this is why when we have that graph on the mural board, it's basically like ease versus difficulty, or easy versus hard. Is like, there's a bunch of films that I want to make that I probably just can't unless I chase people over email for months on end, because there's just no way. Like even the Symbiosis video was because, you know, they work on that land with that landowner and they get landowner permission to go out there and film. You know, there's a group up in North Austin that I'm working with on a potential video in the future about plant rescue. And it's the same thing too. They work on private land, but it's all through developers. So they go in before developers build, and they basically try and remove all the native species that need saving. There's some that are just so abundant they don't need to save, but there's a lot of prairie grass species, whatever, that they remove. And the same thing, it's like they have to jump through hoops with developers to get permission to film out there. And it's just, it's something that I run into a lot where it's like, I want to make this film about X, Y, or Z, but then I'm like, I get into it and I'm just like, okay, this is just not possible in my current state.
I feel like on some of these issues too, though, as you grow as a filmmaker and get more eyeballs, some of it might actually be harder because they won't want you to do it with more eyeballs, but I feel like a lot of it will become easier and people will understand that you're in it for the right reasons and
100%
that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the private piece I think becomes easier. It's one of those tricky things where it's like, I think the private piece becomes easier because once more people know you, they're going to be more willing to let you access their land. And in some cases, they want you to. Like, they want you to showcase their land or whatever. But in other cases, it's almost a detriment. So but I think that's I don't think that's a uniquely Texas thing. It just has its own flavor here. I will say a long-term goal of the channel will be to, and I'm going to probably shoot myself in the foot by saying this, but in the future. But my goal, I do like one of my dream films is to go Colorado from source to sea. And I want to do that for basically every major Texas river. And so the cool thing about that is that in Texas, any navigable river is obviously public property and owned by the people. So you can, as long as you're in the river, you're good.
Good luck when you hit the Blanco.
Yeah. Especially the Narrows. I'm sure all the people screaming at me from up there. But
that's a crazy one for sure.
Yeah, I've thought about that one too. It's again, it's just one of these things where I'm like, every time I'm filming, I'm like, is somebody going to point a gun at me today, or somebody going to yell at me, or call the cops on me? What's going to happen? So
probably all of the above.
Or all the above. But that's just part of it. And it is just what it is. You know, it is another kind of thing with Texas. Like, obviously, you know, despite being the biggest of the 48, we have the least amount of public land relative to our size. A lot of that is because of how Texas came to be. Again, going back to that time period, Texas, when it was a nation, had no money whatsoever. So how do you pay people? Well, we have nearly, at that time, infinite amount of land. I can't pay you money, but I'll pay you in land. So that's a large reason why there's not a lot of public land. But that's just the nature of being here. So
absolutely,
got to figure it out.
Well, Dylan, I can't thank you enough for coming on. This has been a ton of fun, and very much looking forward to the films you have coming out. I'm very excited for them, and this is so thankful that you're taking time out of your life to do this. You know, you got a full-time job, but you're out here producing all these films that are just so educational, and so I know I really appreciate it. Thank you. A lot of other people do too.
Perfect. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, actually, last thing real quick, how can people get a hold of you? I mean, you have website, socials,
I keep it easy. Everything is just my first name and last name. So cool. YouTube's my first name and last name, Dylan Bures. And then my website is dylanbures.com. And then my social media is also just Dylan Bures.
Easy enough. So, I like it. Consistency.
Feel free to, subscribe, shoot me messages. I'm always down for ideas too. Some of ideas that I'm working on for new films have come from people reaching out to me. So if you think you have a really cool story or idea or access to private land that's really cool, that has a cool story, especially that, reach out to me. And whether that's through Instagram, whatever, it doesn't matter. Love to hear it.
Right on. Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah. Thank you guys.